This week, Matt Brown from Brown Fine Security joins us to talk about firmware analysis using AI. Stay tuned. Below the Surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. This is episode number 65, being recorded on December 11th, 2025. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by my co-worker, Mr. Vlad Babkin. Vlad, welcome.
Hello.
Mr. Matt Brown has rejoined us. Matt's no stranger to the show. Of course, has an amazing YouTube video channel on firmware analysis and reverse engineering, which if you haven't checked it out, you should definitely go check it out. Matt, welcome back to Below the Surface.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, it's good to have you on the show. Just a quick announcement before we dig into the topic for today. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. I believe collectively the three of us have been, and probably a lot more people that have been doing, especially any kind of reverse engineering for some time, are expanding our usage of AI tools. I've tested quite a large number of them. I think I usually come back to Claude Code. Matt, I noticed you had some videos that where you were using Claude Code in your videos in some interesting ways. What first kind of led to the initial discovery and kind of switch from our more traditional tools in adding on these AI tools?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I gotta admit, I was a bit of an LLM AI skeptic at first.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe I wasn't the first adopter of these tools, more just started off with that, I'll stick to my manual analysis
Right.
approach to reverse engineering, firmware analysis, things like that. But as I started to see people posting use cases out there, and especially LLM platforms with tool calling, Claude Code, Cursor, that
Yep.
can interact and fully understand the shell of my computer, just as I would be using all of my open source tools on the command line to take apart firmware, to reverse engineer binaries. I started to see some use cases form, and yeah, just been exploring ever since.
You know, it's interesting. I used Emba really heavily. And what I found is it's kind of like the opposite approach. I let Emba run on the firmware and it just collects all the information, right? And of course, you've got some tuning that you can do with Emba, but you just get this huge report. And then I would go through the report and I would go look for specific things. And what I find that I do using something like Claude Code is I typically unpack the firmware first. I have a script that runs on Blob, which handles 90+% of the firmware out there, right? So basically, to save tokens, I unpack it, plop it in a directory, run Claude Code, and then I ask it specific questions of what I want, right? So I'm not starting off with this massive amount of data and trying to sift through it. I'm creating the data that I want to see and building on it. And I think that's the thing that really impressed me the most about this approach.
Yeah, and that's been my experience as well. I'm not trying to completely replace myself in the
Mm-hmm.
analysis process.
Right.
I'm oftentimes uh, walking the LLM on target, as we were kind of
Yep.
talking about before the show. Sometimes you got to hold its hand and be like, "No, hey, I want you to go do this thing," and you have to be insistent. But providing the context, right? So you're like saying, okay, I'm gonna run unblob, bin walk. I'm gonna, or maybe some manual unpacking of the firmware ahead of time, and then you're going to hand it all of these different resources and
Mm-hmm.
maybe some custom tools to help you to learn about how the system is acting and maybe do some vuln discovery.
Yeah. What I found too, and like I almost find this is like cheating, right? But if the firmware has any open source components that are on GitHub, I tend to pull those down. Like anything related to the firmware or project that is open source, I pull that down and I stick it in that directory too. And I'm like, oh my God, the results are just so much better. Because if any, rather than decompiling, I'm like, here's the source code that they're using. And it can just do such amazing things with that. I mean, I feel like it's cheating, but there's no real cheating in hacking, right?
Oh yeah.
hacking and cheating have this relationship, right? It's whatever gets us there faster. I also find that, the folks listening, and Matt, you just kind of alluded to this, is I'm not just taking the firmware and just prompting it saying, "Hey, go find all the vulnerabilities for me." Like it doesn't work. You can try it, but I'm telling you right now, it doesn't work hardly at all when you do it that way, right? You have to be very specific, as you were saying, Matt.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. And so oftentimes I think all hackers we get the spidey sense, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I think there's this class of vulnerability that's on a system or
Yes.
in a firmware file or something like that. And so you're giving it that very targeted inclination of, hey, go try to find this vulnerability. And I've had a lot more success
Yeah,
when you
me
give it
too.
that direction.
Even specific, like you take a class of vulnerabilities or a vulnerability class, like authentication bypass. And then what I'll do too is I'll be more specific. And I'll be like, okay, what are the various authentication bypass techniques? And I'll say, go test for just this one first, right? And so even being more specific than the main vulnerability class, specify a technique that you want it to test, and it does way better, way better. What about you, Vlad? Are you using it in a similar kind of way, or you have slightly different
Yeah.
technique?
So I have slightly different in general approach to this. So I like to have the firmware actually running somewhere, so not just statical analyzing it. And in this case, like I like to actually go ahead and see what's up with the running device or like a
Yep.
virtualized version of it. So this way, oh hey, so there is this huge binary. You can start to analyze it statical and take a few days, or if you manage to get it running, you can understand what it does in a few minutes, right? Because, oh, hey,
Mm-hmm.
this is a web server, and oh, hey, it has all of these queries, I guess. So while it's maybe not as complete, it's much faster. And also, you can get the AI to actually, like, as you said, spidey sense for vulnerability classes, right? So again, depending on what you just found. And also, I'm kind of using it as a developer as well. So
Mm-hmm.
what I found it really good at is when you give it a very specific task. Again, you cannot ask it to, oh, hey, please refactor my code. It will.
Mm,
You will not
yeah.
like the results.
Yep.
Uh, but if
Agreed.
you
Yeah.
ask it for something more specific, like, oh, hey, here is a well-defined interface for you now called the function, that works much better.
Yeah. I've also found that using the keywords, uh, create a plan with phases and milestones that I can review, has been super helpful, both in vulnerability research and using it to just write code for me. I tend to say that, especially, even a smaller feature, I'll be like, just don't go make these modifications yet, but show me a plan, give me multiple phases and milestones, and explain what you're going to do this thing. And then, like, that's the rest of the prompt is what I want it to do. And then I can kind of cherry pick because it kind of you can see it get off the rails before it goes off the rails, and you can be like, oh no, you know what, do phase one, milestone one, two, and three, but not four, but do five, right? And I've actually told it to do stuff like that. I'm like, no, skip that step. Like you're going way too crazy there. Have you guys found that too? That like the LLMs in general try to be too helpful, almost to their detriment. You have to kind of scale it
Yep.
back. That I'm not the
Yep.
only one to experience this, right?
Oh
Yep.
yeah. Yeah,
Also,
it does fill in the blanks when you don't give it
Right.
like only like do this thing and then I like using negative prompts of like don't go past this
Mm-hmm.
point until I tell you that you kind of give it
Right.
like a
Right.
don't do this, not just like a do this because then it will interpret it very broadly.
Correct. And it does the opposite thing too. Like I was just explaining before we started recording, it'll leave stuff out. If you, because again, you're talking
Yep.
to a computer, right? And like you haven't explicitly told it, like it'll build a function and not call the function. I'm like, well, did you did you actually use that? Oh no, I defined it. I'm like, you did a great job defining it. Don't get me wrong. I'm like, but you have to call it so that we can use the data that results from the function. So I found it does that as well. You have to watch for that.
Yep. Also, it likes to refactor the entire class instead of like, oh, hey, changes this one function. Yes, I
Yep.
will only do just that. Goes ahead and changes like 5 files along with the function you asked it to change.
Right. And
So
it's not great at
that
regression
allows to
testing
do
after
that.
it does that. And I've often found that
Yep.
it'll remove functionality or introduce or reintroduce a bug while it's recoding that, that entire method or function. So,
Yep. Also, what I found it really helpful for is like two specific tasks. Specific task one, generate documentation for a function. Like
mm-hmm.
especially great with when function is semi-readable, like let's imagine Python, which exists in firmware, right? So, oh hey, document this, and it does great on that. So almost no extra configuration needed. You get something semi-decent. So I used it on the code not just in firmware, but in like our own code base, and that
Mm-hmm.
works great. Like 99% of the time, it produces documentation which you're happy with. And also, what I found great for it is unit tests. It
Yeah.
sometimes goes ahead and generates way too many detailed unit tests, so you might want to remove some of them.
Right.
But the whole point, if you ask it to make you unit tests and then remove a few, that's still much faster than writing the manual.
Yeah. And you
So,
got to make sure it actually does the unit test and not isn't just passing it. Because sometimes I feel like
yep.
LLMs were created to just appease us humans. And I'm like, no, it's okay if it fails. Like, don't just make it pass just for the sake of passing. I find it does that if you're not paying
Yep.
attention.
Yep. And this is where also all of the problems come with it. Like, oh, hey, it just casually drops production database after being specifically instructed not to. Well, that's because it's trying to be way too helpful.
Right. I also find that I don't have to dig if I'm analyzing source code with it. I don't have to dig through the code myself. Like I know there's code in there that does this specific piece of functionality. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, could I
Yep.
go dig and find it? But that would take me a long time. If I prompt Claude, I'm like, hey, go find me in the code that handles this, right? And then you can kind of follow on to that. I'm like, all right, well, show me once that function returns a value, where does that go and how is it processed? So you can just guide Claude to give you just the code snippets that you want to see, which is
So
awesome.
there is one comment to that. If you have actual code where you can do this, you can probably use grep and get results much faster.
Hmm.
But again, for grep, you actually need some keywords. So if you don't exactly know what keywords you're even looking
Right.
for, you probably should ask Claude. But what we have with LLMs is that it often omits results. So even if you get results from Claude, my recommendation would be to actually do grep afterwards
Yeah, to
to make
verify.
sure that it didn't miss like three other functions which do the same thing.
Right. Matt, you had an interesting use case where you had Claude interact with a TTY serial console for a device. Tell us about that. That was an interesting exercise.
Yeah, so the Claude skills are kind of a key part of my automation stack. And so
Mm-hmm.
Claude skills, I mean, the TLDR is it's just a markdown file with a, kind of a header section where it will read the header, the description of your tool, your skill, and then it will decide to use that, and then it doesn't read the whole description into the context window, so it saves you some tokens. So
Mm-hmm.
it only reads the rest of your tool description and how to use it if it needs to.
Is a
So
skill like a GPT or space and perplexity?
ooh, I'm not as familiar with those tool sets,
Yeah,
so
so like
I'm
in
not sure.
like Perplexity, for example, like I trained it to write a blog post as me. And all I do is I create a space and then you customize the prompt. Like every time I prompt you in this space, you also prompt it this way. So I'm like basically like go look at eclipsium.com to pull content and writing style. And then you can upload files to it. And it's kind of like a poor man's way. Like you're not training the model, you're just giving it context. And then in the files thing, I'm like, here's 6 PDFs of blog posts that I wrote. Use that also for the writing style. And it does a pretty good job of writing stuff like as Paul for Eclipsium, right? I mean, it's by no means perfect. Like, could I just prompt it to write an entire blog post? I mean, sometimes it does better than others and saves me more time, than other times, but it works well. But in Claude, I haven't really explored the, what did you call those in Claude?
Skills.
Skills. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what is it, just an XML file that you're providing context to, or?
It's a it's a markdown file with a, I forget, it's like it's not a YAML, but there's some kind of like
Mhm.
front matter. Um
Mhm.
there's been a front matter at the top of the markdown file, and so it loads into the context window when
Mhm.
you start Claude Code. It
Yep.
will read all of your skills. So you put them in .claude/skills
Mhm.
and then under there you have all your tools, and so it will go into every one of those files, and it will just read the front matter, the description of the tools, and then
Yep.
if it decides to use the tool, so I have my picocom tool,
Mhm.
the terminal emulator, and then in the further description of the tool, it tells it how to set the baud rate, how to
Mhm.
interact, the default path of the TTY to use, and to use a different one
Mhm.
if you're specified, if you're prompted to. And so
Oh
what
yeah,
this
and I
allows
can
me to
see that
do,
that saves a
yeah,
lot of tokens too, because it's not trying to go figure that stuff out, burning tokens.
exactly, yeah, that's the whole idea. And so you can obviously build this. So in this case, picocom is a custom tool, or sorry, an open source tool, but you can
Yeah.
also build skills for custom tools, which is a really cool kind of development cycle that I have gone through recently,
Right.
where sometimes I will manually find a vuln without any LLM help, and then I will create a Claude Code session. I will basically walk the LLM on target to be like, hey,
Yep.
look, there's this
This is the
vulnerability.
vulnerability you're looking for. Yep.
And then I'll be like, hey, go write a tool that would find that vulnerability or
Right.
that class of vulnerabilities. And now what I do is I go one step further and I say, okay, now write a Claude skill to
Yep.
to to integrate that into my stack. And so
Yeah,
so that
because if you
part
don't,
sense.
it forgets it, right?
Yep.
I've noticed that like I had it create a shell script that just reloads my Docker application, right? It was Python Flask with Docker basic setup. And it was running all these wacky commands to like restart my app. And I'm like, well, timeout. Like write me a script that does this. And I added like extra features, like give me a log parameter so I can just run like this script logs and it just tails the logs automatically from the running container. And then I'm like, okay, use that from now on. But then like the next session, it forgot that I told it that. But the skill is the way to help it remember like how you want it to behave during that session, basically, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think the cool thing is that in those sessions, if it ever trips up, then I'm always saying, okay, hey, something got messed up along here. Go rewrite, go amend the
The
skill.
skill, yeah.
And then that way the next time it's always going to go into that .claude skills, that
Mm-hmm.
path, and it's going to pull that new definition in when it chooses to execute a skill.
Right.
Yeah. And
That's awesome.
so this specific skill again was interacting with my my UART tooling, so that
Yeah.
way I can give Claude either a live shell on a device. So sometimes I'll get the TTY logged into like a
Mm-hmm.
shell on a Linux device, and then I will say, hey, you can access this TTY interface, and you can have a shell on this device to poke around with.
Yeah.
There's been other situations where you don't have a shell, but maybe you have standard error and standard out of
Mm-hmm.
the main program that's running, and that's super helpful too. That if it's writing that out to the console. And there's been situations where I've had a binary protocol that I was reverse engineering, and it would write its logs to the console. So I could have Claude send
Yeah.
payloads
And then
to
monitor. Yep.
over the network, and it could literally monitor,
Mm-hmm.
the results, the error messages that were being generated, and so it was able to craft eventually a successful payload.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. And I love it. Like we would still explore the command line ourselves, but it's kind of nice. Like, you get dropped into some of these limited shells or bootloaders or whatever, and you're like, well, like, what is this? And what are the commands do I have at my disposal? Like, it's LLMs are really great at like, hey, I get this command prompt, like, go try a bunch of stuff and tell me as much as you can about it, right? I think a prompt could probably be just like that because you just let it go. That's where like letting it explore, letting it somewhat hallucinate actually kind of helps in this type of research, right?
Oh yeah.
It's great. That's great. Um, so what kind of firmware have you been looking at recently with Claude? I know you had a recent video. I don't remember what the firmware. You've analyzed so many different types of devices, Matt.
Yeah, so a lot of the recent Claude stuff has been targeting an IP camera. And
Mm.
so this project of mine to build this like hackbot or whatever, just my Claude code infrastructure, started around a camera that implemented the OnVIF protocol. So
Mm-hmm.
in the kind of commercial security world, the IP camera world, there's a standard called OnVIF that defines a bunch of APIs, and they're SOAP based, so it's like gross
Dude,
XML
yeah,
data going back and forth. And I didn't want my eyes to bleed out reading that spec, and so
right.
it was really great. Is you just say, "Hey, Claude, go read this spec
Yep.
and create me a tool." And so there's in the OnVIF specification there are a number of pre-auth API endpoints,
Yep.
like endpoints that you can access without authentication, and
Mm-hmm.
then the rest of them should require authentication. The keyword
Right.
being should. So I wrote a tool that would go and try to access every API endpoint without
Mm-hmm.
authentication to and kind of match it up with the spec
Right.
and try
It's
to
so funny. I
find
did
if
this.
any
I did the
defect.
same thing. I did the same thing for
Yeah.
another device. Yeah.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, and it's really great at if there's API documentation, and in some cases, the back end like code for the API is also open source, so you can git clone that, and then Claude can create anything you want that interfaces with the API. Is really great because it has like an API is very structured, right? And the documentation is very structured. So LLMs are, I think, really great at reading that documentation and then allowing you to implement the API, which if you've ever coded against an API, yes, you could know how to program really well in Python, but the specifics of what you're trying to do are in that API documentation. And having an LLM to help you code that is, I'm like, oh my god, I wish I had this sooner, because I've spent
So
so many hours of my life like reverse engineering an API and writing the Python code for it.
yes, there is also like a use case where we try to integrate with a bunch of devices. And what we did was at one point, oh, hey, so there is this request which gives information that we want from the device. And it is like some kind of random request which gets XML as a response. And like, again, it's painful to write a parser when you don't exactly know the structure
Right.
or anything like that. Or even if you know it, it's sometimes painful. So what I did was, oh, hey, let me drop that as a comment. And like, this request exists. And then, hey, I was using Junie in this case, like JetBrains version of Claude.
Yeah.
And hey, Junie, can you please implement me a function which interacts with this and collects this type of data so that it's present in the response of the device? And like, okay. And it just did it. And like I repeated this like for like what 10, 15 times for various devices, and I had a lot of success with it. In this case, you actually do need to drop stuff like example request responses if you don't have full documentation. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
researcher still has to go ahead and poke the device with a stick. But overall, I had a lot of success with this. When you have like not a full API, but like let's say web UI is just making interactions with the device, and oh hey, I like this request which I would like to extract. Well, you can just copy the body for it and like, oh hey, there is this request. Can you please make a method that sends it out? And that saves a ton of time usually.
I've found that in general it saved me a lot of time. Doesn't matter, as we've said, it doesn't magically do your research for you, find vulnerabilities and
Hmm.
disclose them. I mean, OpenAI has kind of experimented with that in open source using very large models, I think to a pretty high degree of success. But the tools that we have at our disposal really like save us a lot of time. I feel like that's the I want to go to Claude Code though, and speaking of saving time, that doesn't come without like pros and cons. And one of the cons is this LLM is running on my system. I probably should be better and let it run in a VM. But I don't know if either of you experimented with giving it some more guardrails, right? Because I've heard horror stories, right? Someone, another podcast host, was like, it wiped out all my VMs. Like I was using Vagrant or something, and it created a script, and it wiped out all my VMs. And someone else was like, yeah, it ran like a kill all command for all the bash sessions on the system, so I lost access. Right. So how do you guys like put the rails around, some guardrails around it?
Hmm. That's a great question, and so far I haven't. So probably need to look into that. I
Yeah,
do.
the defaults do ask you, like, hey, do you give it permission to run this command? And then you like, do you give it permission to run the grep command during this entire session? And I'm like, that's fine. I'm like, but what if you're piping grep to some other command? Are you still just going to run grep and run other commands after it? Are you going to ask me, like, if you're going to run the RM command along with grep? Are you going to ask me or not? Or because it started with grep, you're just going to run grep? I'm like, yeah, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
So there is also like what I found specifically in JetBrains. I'm not sure if it exists elsewhere, but you can actually specify regex for commands you want to allow it running automatically.
Yeah,
So this answers your questions exactly. So
yeah.
if
I
you
know
would
there's a
like to
rule,
allow it to
right?
run grep, you
Yeah.
can totally do that.
Yeah, there is like a rules file that I haven't fully explored. I kind of just rely on it manually prompting me for like, you sure you want to do this kind of thing. And it's done okay with that, but the next step is I want some rules around it for sure. My next
Yeah,
question was, we've talked about Claude Code. The model that I'm using now is the Opus 2.5 or 4.5. Is it 4.5? I think
4.5,
I
I
think it's
think.
4.5.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they kind of touted that as like, this is the next greatest coding model. But have you experimented with other models from other vendors like Gemini or anyone else?
A little bit. I actually started because, like I said, I'm not like an LLM expert. I use this as a tool to help me
Mm-hmm.
do the thing that I am good at, which is the firmware and reverse engineering. So I started just using just playing around with LLMs and Cursor, and
Yep.
obviously they give you access to a bunch of different models. And
Yep.
so I played around with Grok One Code, their like fast coding
Mm-hmm.
agent, which is really fast, but it just wasn't as, I guess, powerful
Yeah.
as Cursor has
I
been.
tried the Gemini CLI
Sure.
for coding, and it was the same thing. I just didn't find it was anywhere close to what Claude gives me.
Yeah.
Vlad, you said you were using some of the JetBrains models. How have those been working? I mean, I'm a huge fan of JetBrains, by the way. I've developed on it before.
so
It's great.
so in this case, they have like at least three different AI things. So first one is inline suggestions. So this is mostly useful when you're actually coding, and it can just suggest you the whole line or the whole like a little bit of code that you're trying to finish, and it just does it in line without any prompts. So at first it was very noisy, but recently I would say that it is doing a pretty good job. Like in many
Mm-hmm.
cases, it actually suggests well. The only thing to be aware of as a developer is if it tries to suggest a lot of the same code, at one point you need to notice this and, oh, hey, I probably should do a loop here instead of trying to like,
You're right.
unroll it with AI, right? So like it might lead to bad architecture if you don't watch yourself. Second thing they have is classic AI chat in IDE. And in this case, they do automatically add context with the current file, but you can actually add files to context manually, and it is de facto classic AI chat, and they don't really have their own models there, so you get a pick of the models. Let me check which ones exist. So yeah, they allow you to communicate with Claude, GPT, Grok, and there are also more models. I
Mm-hmm.
believe they have O 03, O 04, like so Grok, Gemini, GPT. They don't have Claude in, no, they have Claude in there actually. So yeah, so you just pick your model, and they have a default pick for you, which is in my case Gemini 3 Pro. So all of that shenanigans exist with AI chat, and then they
Yep.
have Junie, which is like Claude Code but in JetBrains IDE. And
Yep.
I don't remember what model it uses, but I think that it also uses something like not their own model, but probably something open source or commercial as well. And I had a lot of success with it as well. So I would
Interesting.
say this is a very strong alternative to Claude Code. So the only issue with it is that it is JetBrains IDE specific stuff. So they do have this AI assistant integrated with other IDEs already as well. But yeah, JetBrains ecosystem is kind of closed. So
Right,
even if you
right.
install it in another IDE, it will not be quite the same. But within JetBrains IDE, these tools are hard to beat. Right? Even
Right.
if you install stuff like GitHub Copilot, it's just gonna be slightly worse because of user experience. Like, for example, to generate documentation, I'm not even writing prompts. I have a nice button that pops up whenever I just open a documentation command in Python, for example, and it just has a generate documentation right there,
Mm.
right? So, and you can predefine a bunch of actions for yourself like this. So in this case, they also have really good user experience in there rather than just chat, right? So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so this is the main upside for it. But I would say that Junie and Cloud Code are pretty close to each other in functionality.
Nice. It's awesome.
So
You know,
hard for me to tell which one is better. Depends on
it's
the task.
interesting. You know, we spend the first part of the show talking about how we use it for our own coding experiences, our own vulnerability research. I'm curious, like, will it catch up in adoption where the people who are writing this firmware are using it, listening to the show, going, "Oh wait, like the security researchers are using it in this way. Wouldn't it be nice if the manufacturers and vendors used it and use it to flesh those bugs out before they shipped it?" And I think that
Oh,
that's not a technology problem. I think technology is the least of the concern there, right?
there is one important point about it all. By default, AI can actually produce vulnerable code.
Mm,
So the code it produces sometimes does contain vulnerabilities. I have seen that more than once. It's trained on stuff like GitHub. GitHub is not the
right.
place which contains perfect code, right? So because of this, it has like code with vulnerabilities in its training. And because of it, if it tries to replicate it thoughtlessly, it might produce it. So even if you produce code with it, you have to be careful about it dropping vulnerabilities in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know there's definitely a lot of startups out there in kind of the AI powered software code review space
Mm-hmm.
that are trying to, I'm sure what they're doing is they have some kind of a RAG set up where they have good like they have examples of like vulns, like good code, bad
Yeah.
code,
Yep.
right, where they're helping to fine tune the model and those models to again they're walking it on target to be like, hey, this is what's bad, this is what's good.
Right. Yeah, and I think they're making progress in those models, right? Because you got vulnerable code, you've got not vulnerable code, and then when you have a patch, you can like train the LLM to go, this is just the what the fix looks like, right? So this is the result. This is before the patch, using just those data points alone, you can create some pretty powerful stuff. Probably what went into OpenAI's, I forgot what tool they call that, but the one that's looking at open source projects, finding vulnerabilities, creating a patch, and then issuing the pull request, which is pretty awesome, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. It'll be interesting to see in the next 10 to 20 years if certain bug classes start to
Just go away. Yeah.
kind of go away. Obviously, there's certain bug classes that will be harder, like business
Yep.
logic vulnerabilities. I don't see those getting fixed like wholesale. We're not going to like solve that problem
Yeah.
anytime soon,
Yeah,
right?
because logic stuff, it's still a computer, right? And it's still a bunch of conditional statements. It doesn't have consciousness. So oftentimes, like, I'll look at something and I'll be like you were really like technically focused on this one thing. But if you just step back and look at it, I'm like, the vulnerability is right there. And the LLMs aren't going to see that. A human is going to see that. I'm like, wait, do it this way. And it's like, oh yeah, I can do it that way. Like, it doesn't get excited like I'm excited. I'm like, no, we just found a vulnerability. Like, this is great. And it's just like, it doesn't see that, right? You still need to,
Yeah.
doesn't get logic at all, because it doesn't have consciousness, just basically a bunch of conditional statement. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat that too much, but because it is helpful and does more than just conditional statements, but it doesn't understand the code that it's looking at or writing, right? It's just
Absolutely.
making decisions on what it was trained on.
Yep. It's a I like to think about it like as a statistical parrot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's parroting whatever it was trained on, literally.
Mm.
And in this case, it's just really, really good at parroting. but like a parrot will repeat whatever you tell it. It might actually construct something on its own, but it's not gonna have a deep understanding on whatever you are trying to get it to parrot, right? So
Right.
LLMs are kind of the same exact way. So if you ask it to find something and don't indicate that you want to also cover the case where this isn't found, well, it will try to find something everywhere, and it will be successful at finding it everywhere, even if it is not there. This is something that we observe constantly. Or, for example, it might actually try to please the user way too much, and because of it, it will just, again, hallucinate something that's not even in the source code in the first place and tells that it exists there. So this is how we get the problem that people are writing about. Oh, hey, so we got a lot of submissions of false positive vulnerability finds. Like how you
Right.
get there? Well, whomever is doing bug bounty really wants to find the vulnerability and gets the bounty. So AI just goes and finds vulnerabilities where there aren't any.
Mm.
So there is also the other end of the spectrum for the problem.
Have you guys used it to find web application vulnerabilities specifically?
I'm less focused in the web app space. I know that tools like Kaido are trying to do a lot of like LLM integration with their web scanning tooling and even manual augmentation, like augmenting manual testing with AI. So they've been doing some stuff, but that's less of my skill set. So no, I
Yeah.
haven't like got like a golden use case bug of like I just let AI run on the web and find this thing.
Yeah, I've used it to, like, when you unpack the firmware, the web application code will be in there typically. And so I like telling it, hey, go find any web application code in here. And I'm like, then tell me all about the architecture. Like, tell me what language, what framework, what versions of libraries. Like, if it's npm, does it have a manifest? Let's see what packages it has, what libraries it's implementing. And some that's even just that is a great starting point before you like run burp suite and actually manually go find the vulnerabilities. Then you can kind of tell it to document the web application. You can tell it to find some vulnerabilities, and I find it's a great starting point. Now when I fire up, I'm going to do manual analysis, I've got the areas that I really want to focus on, and it saved me a whole bunch of effort in grepping and discovery to figure out what's going on. In just a few prompts, I can get a feel for what the web application is and areas that I might want to focus on, and that's a huge time saver for me.
So I didn't specifically try to use it to detect vulnerabilities, but it is helpful when you try to understand what you're looking at, especially if you have something really big you're looking at. And again, I'm using a lot of more of traditional tooling in this case. Like for example, okay, I just found an Node.js app. How do I find its packages? Well, there is package.json.
Right.
So I don't really need an LLM to get me a list of packages if I know the exact files that contain it. So I would say that relying on LLM in this case might actually be detrimental because like it might hallucinate extra packages. So what we try to use LLM for is parsing out advisories for like vulnerable versions and details on that. And what LLMs do, at least I had a lot of pain with it, is like when I ask it to get me versions out of it, it will just produce either extra version numbers or version numbers with components missing or like with like some letters missing, for example, and that becomes very critical very fast. So asking
Right.
it to extract a specific piece of package.json might actually not extract you everything. So if
Right.
you want a list of libraries, I would rely a lot more on like more static tooling. Like
Yeah.
what LLM is good for is, oh hey, does it even have package.json or is it even based on Node.js in the first place, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, because then
And
I
it's
would
also
probably use a tool like Gripe to go in and enumerate
yep.
all the vulnerabilities in the React app.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, but at the same time, it's also really good at, oh, hey, so you have a compressed blob of front-end source code. Well, you can first of all prettify it using just the
Yep.
standard public tooling. And once it's prettier, you can actually use LLM to like try to find interesting functions in it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like LLM is, again, as I have said, really good at documenting code. So instead of trying to read through whatever you just prettify it, you can ask an LLM to try to produce reasonable documentation for it. And suddenly you have a lot easier time navigating the code, right?
Right. And it still
So
hallucinates, though. I mean, it's still. I have one
mhm.
app that Claude is convinced no matter what I tell it, there's an authentication bypass, and I'm like, dude, that's not an authentication by. Stop saying that. It's not. It's not. I validated it is not. And it just believes what it wants to believe, which is sometimes frustrating.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing that I've noticed that I have yet to get it to do well. It's less important because obviously this is easy to do manually, but like when
Mm.
it does find things, the risk assessment is always overhyped. I feel like
Yes.
it's
Yes.
like everything's it'll be like all caps. I found a critical vulnerability,
Yeah.
and you're like, whoa, calm down. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
like context. Like this isn't like the end of the world. So
Right. Yeah,
it
because you
it
gotta
doesn't do
you
a
gotta
great job.
take into account like the functionality of the device. Like you mentioned in an IP camera, it may make a big deal if someone can get a hold of the video stream even after they authenticated through a vulnerability. And I'm like, but if I'm authenticated to the device, I can see the video stream. So even if there is a
Mm.
vulnerability that lets me read the video stream, it'll list that as like a high severity alert. I'm like, no, that's not even a finding. It's not a finding. I mean, maybe it is, but
Yep.
it's not. I mean, command injection authenticated, perhaps, but if the device is intended to give the user a console like a KVM, I'm like, that's not a finding. Like, just
Yep.
if I can inject commands on the device, I can also enable SSH on the device through the web interface. So that's intended functionality, but Claude will
So
list that as a vulnerability.
so in this case also, what I like to do is like whenever I find a vulnerability either manually or LLM assisted or whatever, I usually try to make a POC. Like if I cannot really make a
Mm-hmm.
POC for it, it's not a finding. Like maybe
Right,
it's a weakness, so maybe it's still worth reporting and fixing, but it's not an immediate vulnerability. So that's for example point one. And point two, like you have to actually apply your human brain. Oh hey, so I found authentication bypass on the camera, and then using credentials I just got, I managed to get video stream. Well, the first part is definitely vulnerability, right?
right.
So potentially you can actually try to scope it down on, oh, hey, this device is supposed to allow you to use a video stream once you are authenticated. So maybe you can actually scope it down a bit. But again, unless you have like thousands of false positives, you might want to sift through them manually. Like
Yeah,
because if AI finds like, okay, let's say you just analyzed firmware with it. Let's say you managed to squeeze out 50 vulnerabilities out of AI for it. Well, just go over them manually. 50 vulnerabilities is not that much if you are reviewing a large firmware, right? So depending on just how many finds you have and how much like return you might get over finding even a single one to be valid, spending like half a day reviewing all 50 of them might be useful.
right.
But you cannot rely on AI to just reliably produce a finding and just send it off to maintainers and just
No, yeah,
say
because
that
people that
it's
do that,
fine.
yeah, the maintainers get
Yeah,
really mad. And even I find
yeah,
you tell it to create a proof of concept, we got to be careful because it doesn't. It's not. Although Anthropic cannot listen to the show, but I found that it will just go create an exploit even regardless of how I prompt it. But it'll definitely most of the LMs will create like a testing tool. Like, hey, I'm testing this app or this is my app, and I need a Python script that tests for this specific bug. I wouldn't even have to call it a vulnerability, right? It tests for this bug. That bug just happens to be a vulnerability. It'll happily go create an exploit for that. I mean, even if it's a test tool, you go then look at the test tool and you're like, well, rather than something benign, I could tell it to do, something a little more malicious
Mm.
inside of that. So I find it like it does create proof of concepts, but you got to guide it in the right way. And what you end up with, you got to tweak at the end.
Right. Right. Yeah, yeah, no, but the spamming the bug bounty world, I mean,
Yes.
obviously we've seen what's happened to curl and just the ridiculous
Yeah.
bug
Poor
bounty
Daniel.
reports
Right.
that get submitted to there. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Well, and
Like,
Carl takes in so much user data. I think it's one of the utilities that has like the most command line options. It's got so many. There's like exact numbers that he's talked about. Daniel has talked about on podcasts, right?
yeah.
And so given that you with that many inputs, yeah, if you turn an LM loose on it, it's gonna want to find vulnerabilities in it. And poor Daniel gets hammered, with those reports. I still think even to this day, he's dealing with them.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
that's
And
way too much.
I think since like with AI tooling, it's only gotten worse, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the bogus reports that he gets, yeah, are
Right. And some of them are
increasing.
bugs, not necessarily vulnerabilities. Some of them are bugs, but
Yeah,
even the bugs aren't like earth-shattering bugs in curl. But it's still good that it's fleshing out bugs. Bad that it's being labeled as a vulnerability when it's not. Because again, it doesn't understand the context, and if the reporter doesn't understand the context, they're just sending it along.
Even if reporter does understand the context and is doing his best, he might mislabel something. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, we had a pen test of our own product, and like a bunch of pen testers, oh, hey, here are two vulnerabilities. And we read the report and realize that it's actually not vulnerabilities, but we understand why they actually label them as vulnerabilities, right?
Mm,
So, like, if I would be the pen tester, I would label it as a vulnerability as well, and that's fine.
right.
But it's actually not. If you actually start to read product details and internal details, it was like actual the other way around. So like the bug was like something was exposing way too much access per their
Mm-hmm.
perspective, but it's actually the other way around where UI was not showing all of the access you are supposed to have. So
Mm,
curl might be in the same position many times, right? So because of how many options it has, it's nearly impossible to track down all of the options which are supposed to work as they are, versus like what's actually a security vulnerability.
right. Right. Um, I wanted to chat a little bit about the man in the middle scripts that you have, Matt, because I have updates to those. So I
oh yeah.
actually took your scripts because you have two repositories on like man in the middle kind of stuff, and it was always like on my plate to like build something that I had a completely like not completely isolated, but a separate network on one side of like a Raspberry Pi, and then on that Pi I have some tools to intercept DNS, to route all the traffic to and from the internet so you can look at it, manipulate it, use man in the middle proxy or SSL strip against the traffic as well. And so I took what you had and then I asked Claude to create me a new script with all this extra functionality. So
Oh,
I'm working on seeking permission to open source that. But I've been using that, in our lab environment, and I'm like, this is super useful. But thank you for producing those tools. I've
yeah.
used them. And if you want to tell our audience like how those tools came to be, right?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's not any like amazing thing I did. It's really taping together in a
Mm-hmm.
shell script multiple different open source Linux tools that are awesome. And so the general philosophy behind the tool is that I want a separate network that I can test devices on. And I might want, like one device you might be testing might use Wi-Fi, another one might use Ethernet. And
Mm-hmm.
so at the heart of my man in the middle router setup is it's just a shell script. It creates a bridge interface, and then
Mm-hmm.
attached to that bridge interface is a wireless network using host APD to spin
Mm-hmm.
up a wireless network. And this lets me tweak a lot of different settings. You'll see some edge case vulnerabilities out there with some different Wi-Fi settings. I've found on a couple of microcontroller SDKs where a device that is configured for like a WPA2 access point, it will happily connect to an open access point of the same SSID. So
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So that's something I always test, and it's
Yep.
just really easy with the minimal proxy because it's just there in the script, and I can just go
Mm-hmm.
in and change the configuration of the network
Right.
through host TPD. So, but that's to create the LAN network
Yep.
that the devices will live on, whether Wi-Fi or
Or
Ethernet.
Ethernet.
You
Yep.
can have both set up. If you want like a device that's on the LAN that's going to like communicate with
Right.
your IoT device, you can do that.
Yep. And then if you
And
set up a
then
packet sniffer on the bridge interface, you get all the traffic coming through, which is convenient.
exactly, all the traffic. So you mentioned trying to set it up on the Raspberry Pi, and I used to do that, but
Mm-hmm.
then I was like running TCP dump on the Raspberry Pi, and I was like
Yeah.
SCPing the PCAPs back so that I could
Yeah.
look at
Yeah.
them, and I was like, I should just run this on like my Linux desktop, and then I can
Right.
kind of
Right.
like cut out the middleman there.
Yeah.
Um,
I was gonna set up like a Samba share or an SSH, like mount the
yeah,
the thing over SSH to that directory, so I could just easily pop them over, or have some kind of script that just automatically sends me back the PCAPs. I
right,
had the
right,
same thoughts. It was really funny.
yeah. So and then that all gets routed out through, basically like IP forwarding,
Yep.
out to whatever your interface on your computer is that has internet access, right?
Yep.
It'll follow the default route on your machine. And then optionally, I've got a set of IP tables ruled
Mm-hmm.
that can redirect certain traffic flows. So let's say I want to redirect all outbound traffic to a destination port of 443, all that TLS
Right.
traffic. Let's say I want to try to do a man-in-the-middle attack on that communications to test whether the device is actually doing certificate validation.
Isn't
So
it crazy? I did this. So man in the middle proxy or SSL strip is the same. I have both of them, so you can choose which one you want to run.
yeah,
And so IP tables takes all incoming traffic on 443, shoots it to the listening port for either of those tools. And then by default, either of those tools create a certificate that's not valid, right? I mean, unless you go get a valid certificate,
yeah,
but it's not valid. And so what it responds back should throw an error to that client device. And I think what your documentation said, Matt, was they don't always check the SSL is valid. I'm like,
oh yeah,
so just setting this up, putting a device behind it, running some traffic through it, helps you determine there's a finding there or not. I mean, this is great.
yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then so redirecting it to those two tools you mentioned. There's another one I want to mention called CERT MITM.
Mm-hmm.
It's CERTMITM, and that's a tool that will do a very similar thing, but it will run multiple different tests. It will, and you can even put like a Let's Encrypt a valid certificate that's not the
Mm-hmm.
right name. Because
Yep.
there are some weird edge
Yes.
cases where some devices will check if it's signed by a trusted CA, but they won't do the CN, the common name matchup
Is
check.
that certificate pinning,
Um,
or does certificate pinning help that not be exploitable?
there's a couple different ways you can do certificate pinning.
Mm-hmm.
The way I describe it, certificate pinning is a subset of certificate validation. So
Right.
typical certificate validation is we verify that the cert that the leaf certificate that is being presented to us is signed down a chain to a root that we trust.
Right. Right.
Certificate pinning is usually like providing a hash or providing the key and just matching against the leaf, saying I don't
Mm-hmm.
care if you have something that's signed by a root that I trust. I'm only going to check. I'm going to basically do a hard coded check against the leaf certificate,
Mm-hmm.
the client certificate, server certificate that's being presented.
Gotcha.
So, so what CertMinimum does is it will run through its various different kind of test variations, and then if they all fail, if the man in the middle attack fails, it will allow that server name and port combination to pass.
Mm-hmm.
It will allow them to pass by, because what you'll see sometimes on a device is it'll be making multiple TLS communications. But let's say there's a device where it reaches out to server one, and then it gets a response from server one,
Mm-hmm.
and then only after that successful
Yes.
exchange, it will reach out to server two. Well, what if the request to server two is the vulnerable one?
Right.
If you're just running SSL strip or cert minim, you're never gonna get past to that point. And
Mm-hmm.
so, SSL strip or man in the middle proxy. But if you use cert minim, it will allow you to keep going down
Oh, that's interesting.
to further flows.
Because what I've done is in my script I can tell it not to run man in the middle proxy or SSL strip, so I get that initial. Because actually I had a device do exactly that. It had to get a valid response back from, and it actually did validate the SSL certificate. Had to get that back before it reached out to, like in your case, server two, and server two is where the vulnerability potentially was.
Yeah.
That's common.
Yeah, and SSL strip and man in the middle proxy, I believe they have like whitelisting and blacklisting options for domains, right? So you could,
Mm-hmm.
with those tools, just incrementally blacklist domains that are not passing. or
Right.
that your man in the middle tech are working on. You could incrementally blacklist them out, and just keep rerunning your testing. But cert minimum
Mm-hmm.
just kind of does all that for you, which is nice.
That's awesome. Yeah. I also built in DNS spoofing
Oh, nice.
into it. So DNS mask is run. And then actually Claude created a separate script and configuration file, made it really easy. So you can just add hostname and IP pairs and it'll update the local DNS server. And if it is configured to honor the DHCP requests and have the DNS server that you provide it, it'll go to your DNS server and look it up. And then you can send any hostname to any IP address that you want, just using DNS mask without any extra DNS tooling. But I think the other thing I want to build into it is that extra DNS tooling, because the article pointed out recently on the nano KVMs that it will ignore DHCP. Was it option 6? I think is the DNS server.
Yeah.
It'll ignore that, has its own hard coded DNS server, which just happens to be in China.
Ah, yeah.
And I'm like, I don't like that. And also, if you want to control DNS, now you've got to do DNS, interception.
Yep.
Which I'm working on some tooling, trying to find something that does that really well. So,
That's
which shouldn't be that hard. I mean, we've been doing that kind of stuff for a long time. So,
Yeah, that's fun. Oh, and another tool that I like to redirect traffic to is NTP. And spoofing NTP, you'll get some weird like off bypasses or
really
stuff
interesting.
sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't name the device, but there was a smart lock where it had the ability of rules you could add. You could like give out an access code that only worked during a certain time or a date.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and you
Oh,
could,
I see.
but it was relying on NTP. And so if you could man in the middle and spoof NTP, you could get it to like shift the top what time it thought it was to allow
Yep.
like an access code to
I'm assuming
work when it was there.
people have already written tools to do that. I would assume.
Yeah, there's a tool out there called DeLorean.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a Python script that will
Yeah.
you can tell it to, spoof a specific time. You can tell it just to do like just to increment the time back or forth or something like that as an offset. Yeah.
That's awesome. It's great stuff. So we're getting close to the end of time. Matt, was there anything else you wanted to share with our audience that you're working on? A sneak peek into some of the stuff you got planned on your YouTube channel.
Ooh, yeah. So the other thing I've been working on recently, I've put out a number of videos so far, is this Android set-top box called Superbox. It's
Oh yeah,
advertised
that was the Krebs
as
article, man. Oh, you
yeah,
got me
yeah.
excited. I love this. I mean, I hate this, but I also find it fascinating, right?
Yeah, so uh, I've done a number of videos kind of like tearing down, getting root,
Mm-hmm.
looking at some of the web traffic coming out of this box. And the thing I'm working on right now is reverse engineering these API calls. So the core like app store that
Mm-hmm.
runs this device, not sketchy at all, is like it's doing its web requests and responses in clear text, but
Mm.
it's like doing this custom obscure AES encrypting of the URL parameters, the payload
Mm-hmm.
basically of the request and response. So it's like so you can't see inside of
Mm.
that to see what's happening. So I'm doing a video, or I'm doing the research and going to do a video
Yeah.
soon where I talk about reversing all that.
It was interesting, I was talking about it last night on my Paul Security Weekly show that in the Krebs article, which is very lengthy, you gotta just keep reading because it gets better when they talk about Superbox first, which is that service, the thing you can buy, free streaming. They send you a device, it's got malware and backdoors. Then they talk about Bad Box 2.0, which is an Android TV streaming devices like the T95 and one of the X88 something. Two of the devices I have. I actually wrote a post about that a couple of years ago. 100% these devices have Android that has Android apps that have backdoors and malware and are doing malicious things. And I validated that, right? I didn't find anything new. Like I validated, I went on Amazon, ripped the devices down, got the firmware. I'm like, yep, this is definitely a thing. That's continued, right? Google has filed a lawsuit. FBI has issued a warning. What I thought was interesting was, I think it was Ashley from Census was doing some of the research, and with Badbox, they discovered that there was a proxy app being put on these devices, and there's a Chinese company selling like a VPN service that the back end is using all of the residential gateways as proxy devices. And they're using that for fraud and crime, and also to as a crawler for AI. Because how great is it to come from a bunch of residential IP addresses?
Yep, it's easy to get by the WAFs. Then it's a lot easier than running your scanning infrastructure right in like EC2 or something. Like they're gonna detect that right away. Yeah.
So like I never would have dreamed that that's how people would monetize vulnerabilities in IoT devices, right? I think it's super creative. Like years ago, like 15 years ago, I gave a presentation at BrewCon and talked about some of this stuff that's actually happening today. I'm like, I actually kind of predicted some of that, but like in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that China would be using us as a proxy and charging money for it. That's just crazy. Well, Matt, as always, good seeing you, man. Thanks for coming on the show today. Vlad, thank you very much for coming on the show as well. It's great chatting with you guys. Love the conversation. I hope people learn stuff from some of the things that we've been doing and experimenting with. So that will conclude this edition of Below the Surface. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.